there was a period in human history, still very close to the beginning, when the world was only starting to take shape outside the Garden of Eden. The events involving Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel had already taken place. And from that point forward, the biblical narrative begins to shift its focus toward the continuation of generations. Families begin to grow, descendants begin to multiply, and a structured lineage starts to form. It is within this context that the Bible introduces a figure whose description is brief, but whose presence stands out in a unique way. His name is Enoch. Enoch appears in the genealogy recorded in the book of Genesis, specifically in the line that comes through Seth, the son who was born after the death of Abel. This detail is important because this lineage becomes the primary line through which the biblical narrative continues, eventually leading to later generations, including Noah and the events of the flood. The text presents Enoch in a very direct manner. It mentions his ancestry, it records his age, and it places him within the sequence of generations. But more than that, it introduces a detail that sets him apart from every other name in that list. To understand this difference, it is necessary to first observe the pattern that the genealogy follows. The structure is consistent. Each person is introduced with the number of years they lived before having children, then the years they lived after, followed by the mention of sons and daughters, and finally, a simple conclusion. And he died. This pattern repeats itself multiple times, creating a rhythm within the text. It establishes a clear sequence and a predictable structure. However, when the narrative reaches Enoch, that pattern is interrupted. The text states that Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah. From that point on, instead of simply continuing the same formula, the text introduces a statement that does not appear in the same way for the others. It says that Enoch walked with God for 300 years after the birth of his son. This expression, walked with God, carries a specific meaning within the biblical context. It is not presented as a single event or a temporary experience. It indicates continuity. It suggests a life marked by constancy, by closeness, and by an ongoing relationship. It is a description of how his life was lived over time, not a moment that happened once. During those years, Enoch also had other sons and daughters, which shows that in terms of human life, his existence followed the same general pattern as others in his generation. He formed a family, he lived within a community, and he remained part of the natural progression of humanity at that time. But even with those similarities, the focus of the text remains on that defining characteristic. The narrative then states that all the days of Enoch were 365 years. This detail stands out immediately. Compared to others in the same genealogy, whose lifespans often extend beyond 900 years, Enoch's life is significantly shorter. This contrast creates a difference that cannot be ignored. But the most distinct element of his story appears in the next statement. Instead of concluding with the usual phrase, the text says that Enoch walked with God, and then he was no longer found, because God took him. This is one of the most unusual statements in the entire genealogy. While every other individual has their death recorded in a direct and consistent way, Enoch's narrative does not follow that pattern. There is no description of death. There is no closing statement that repeats what has been said about the others. Instead, there is a transition that is presented without detail. The text simply indicates that God took him. This difference places Enoch in a very specific position within the biblical narrative. He becomes one of the few individuals described as not experiencing death in the same way as others. Later in the Bible, a similar situation is described with Elisha. But within the context of Genesis, Enoch is the first example of this kind. At the same time, the text does not provide further explanation. It does not describe how this happened. It does not present a visual account. It does not attempt to expand on the event. The statement remains concise, which contributes to the impact of the narrative. Another important aspect is the period in which Enoch lived. He belongs to the earliest generations of humanity, still closely connected to Adam. This means that his life overlaps with individuals who were part of the initial stages of human history. The distance between these generations is not as large as it might appear when reading from a modern perspective. Enoch lived in a time when the memory of the beginning could still be transmitted directly through a small number of people. His position in the genealogy connects him to figures that precede the flood. His son, Methuselah, becomes a key figure known for having the longest lifespan recorded in the Bible, reaching 969 years. In addition, Enoch is the great-grandfather of Noah. This connection is significant because Noah becomes the central figure in the narrative of the flood, one of the most defining events in the early chapters of the Bible. This means that Enoch's place in the genealogy is not isolated. It is directly connected to the continuation of the story. When observing the sequence of generations, it becomes clear that Enoch serves as a link between the beginning of humanity and the events that follow. His presence interrupts the repetitive pattern, but at the same time, it maintains continuity within the lineage. The expression "walked with God" also appears in other parts of the Bible, and it consistently refers to a life of ongoing relationship. It is associated with constancy, with alignment, and with a sustained connection. In Enoch's case, this expression is emphasized, indicating that it defines his life as a whole. Another notable point is that the Bible does not describe specific actions, events, or decisions in Enoch's life in detail. There are no recorded conflicts, no extended narratives, and no sequences of events as seen with other figures. Instead, his story is condensed into a few verses that focus on two main elements: his relationship with God and the way his life concluded. This makes his account one of the shortest narratives in terms of length, but also one of the most distinct in terms of structure. The brevity of the description does not reduce its significance. In fact, it highlights the uniqueness of the way it is presented. It is also important to observe that, although Enoch lived fewer years than others, his account receives a level of attention that many who lived longer do not receive. This suggests that the narrative is not centered on the duration of life, but on how that life is characterized within the text. He is not remembered for external achievements, constructions, or conflicts. Instead, the emphasis remains on a single defining aspect: the way his life is described. Within the genealogy, Enoch stands as a point of contrast. While the structure repeats for others, his story introduces variation. The pattern shifts, even if only briefly, and then returns to its original form after him. Following Enoch, the genealogy continues, moving forward toward the generations that lead to Noah and the events associated with the flood. The sequence resumes, and the narrative continues to develop. When considering the entire context, it becomes evident that even with limited detail, Enoch occupies a unique place in the biblical account. He lived 365 years. He was the father of Methuselah. He belonged to the lineage of Seth. He was the great-grandfather of Noah. And he is remembered as one of the few individuals whose death is not recorded in the same way as the others. His story is brief, but clearly distinct from all the others around it. And from that point forward, the biblical narrative continues, leading the next generations into a new stage of human history.